I'm Alan Valentine. I'm president and CEO of the Nashville Symphony. When I first came here, it was in 1998. It was about 11 years ago. Kenneth Schermerhorn was then our music director, and the orchestra had been gradually building itself back up from a very dark time in its history. Went through some financial turbulence in the 1980s and was recovering beautifully and growing, but still, I think, somewhat to Kenneth Schermerhorn's frustration, it wasn't really happening as fast as he had hoped it would. And so he and I met early on in his tenure, and we began to talk about what his dreams and aspirations were for this orchestra. I just asked him to tell me what he, in his wildest dreams, would hope for this orchestra. Mostly he talked about music. He didn't really talk about this concert hall project, growing the number of full-time players and growing the stature of the orchestra in the classical music community internationally, and that included a trip to Carnegie Hall and a tour of the East Coast. And I brought up the subject of the hall because I had heard the orchestra in its home hall, which was then TPAC, the Tennessee Performing Arts Center. And I felt like the hall probably was one of the single biggest obstacles to the orchestra's future. And when I brought it up, Kenneth immediately agreed, and he said, I know that, the musicians know that, but how do you get a project like this off the ground? Where would we get all of that money? How do you convince the community, which had built TPAC only 20 years earlier, that the orchestra needed now its own concert hall? I just said to him, I don't know how you do all that, but I just know this. You and I need to try. We were going to try to make this an issue for the community. And of course, here it is. Things that I knew from past experience, that the hall would do much more than just become a great space for the orchestra to rehearse and perform in, that it would help leverage the orchestra's future in many, many ways in terms of making the orchestra play better, which it certainly does. The musicians can hear each other better. The audience can hear the musicians better. If somebody's not cutting it, everybody knows. But it also really inspired the musicians to perform much better than they perhaps themselves thought they could. And it became a symbol for the city. I mean, it became emblematic of Music City. All kinds of things recorded here. More studios here, in fact, than there are in either New York or LA. Many people don't realize that. It seemed like a natural progression for this city to embrace the notion of a world-class concert hall in which we could build a real world-class international orchestra. That intersection of Demonbreun and 4th Avenue in Nashville, one of the most important crossroads of music in America. Musical building, it's really what the architect likes to refer to as neo-eclectic. Our choice of the architectural vocabulary was very deliberate. The columns are Egyptian revivalist. The pediment really is more of kind of a Greco-Roman. Famous halls of the world, our shoeboxes. And when you think about the very modern Country Music Hall of Fame, which this hall is adjacent to, the question, the very modern arena across the park, the question is, okay, what do you put on this site that doesn't fight for attention with those other modern buildings? Our musicians also have had the opportunity over the years to work on Music Row. So we really are an orchestral institution that, while we're clearly focused on our mission, and we have a very clear sense of our artistic identity and our mission, we are also open to embracing all kinds of music. Many of the country stars that receive a lot of international publicity also find themselves in our audience. I can tell you that Alison Krauss, for example, comes to concerts frequently. Amy Grant is on our board. Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman have come to concerts here. Garth Brooks and Trisha Yearwood came to the opening. Donna Summer, who lives here, came to the opening. Crystal Gale, and so on. Fortunately, by then we had built the institution to a place where, it could survive in the death of its artistic leader. And the hall really helped us attract the kind of help we needed in the interim. I immediately thought of Leonard Slatkin as the best possible person to conduct the opening because of the orchestra's clear focus on new music. And when Leonard was hired to do that, we were able to entice him to come down beforehand and do a recording project here in the hall. That recording ultimately won us our first Grammy Awards. Leonard saw the hall and heard the orchestra and realized what a tremendous change had taken place in Nashville with respect to the orchestra. He was immediately intrigued, and we were able to convince him then to become our interim artistic advisor. And that really helped raise the stature of the orchestra again, yet even more. But all of these things have sort of a modern reinterpretation about them. And so even the people who were at first somewhat critical of the choice of architectural vocabulary later came back to me and said after it was open, well, I have to say, I know I gave you a hard time, but in the end, you know, it was so well done that I have to say it's a great building and we really love it. It's almost like food for our souls. You know, so many people are hungry and all of these other causes, you know, unemployed, you know, homeless. They're all important causes, but we also have to have food for our souls, because if we don't, then there's no hope. If people feel hopeful and uplifted, then they can address those other issues. It may not be saving people's lives in the streets, but maybe it is saving people's lives in an interesting way.
Ron Losby and I were talking about how music is really the universal language.
It is.
We all think that English is, but really it's not.
No, it's not.
It's music.
It's music, of course.
I think musicians are the ambassadors of the world.
I agree. Musicians know no boundaries. They're citizens of